This is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt, the Christ School of Theology. This will be the last lecture in this series this week. It's on the 12th century context. It's an overview lecture. Next week we'll come back and we'll try to get into some of these thinkers a little bit more deeply, particularly Abelard, a little bit on Bonaventure. We'll get very deep into Aquinas as much as we can in one lecture, and then we'll talk a bit about Scotus and Occam. What I want to talk about now is just basically the 12th century context. In the 12th century, when the universities came into being, teleological thinking was prevalent. Right? The universe existed for an end, which is God, and that there was purpose and meaning everywhere in the universe. Human beings had purpose and meaning. Human beings just are the drive to know the truth and the drive to do the good. Sin did not erase this. To be human is to drive to know the truth and to drive to do the good. Sin brings upon this a certain waywardness, right? So that we drive to know the true in ways and we don't get there, and we try to do the good in ways and we don't get there either. But in the 12th century, we don't have this radical, depraved nature of human beings that comes out of the Lutheran and the Calvinist traditions. We have a creation that's still good, but there's stuff wrong in it, right? Sin has caused problems. Now, in the 12th century, we have a certain very important thing that happens. There's a German by the name of Albertus Magnus, who is a teacher of Thomas Aquinas. And this German, Albertus Magnus, certainly is interested as the Latin Averroists, and this is out of the Islamic tradition, start to bring Aristotle's corpus into the West. Now, of course, we know that some of Aristotle had always been in the West, but the West had lost great parts of the canon of Aristotle. It was preserved in the Islamic tradition, and of course later on it was rediscovered and translated into Latin. But the first translations of Aristotle in the West came out of the Islamic tradition. And so now we have Aristotle entering the West, and he has a couple very interesting things to say. The first thing he has to say is that the soul is not immortal. He's got a different view on the soul than Plato does. And this came as rather a shock to church fathers in the West and theologians, but he's just so darn good at thinking, People are impressed with this guy. He's got great arguments. His theory of knowledge, of going out and capturing the intelligible species and the active intellect and impressing that on the potential intellect, seem to capture what it is to know. And so real knowledge was advanced through Aristotle, many thought, right? And if human beings are the drive to know the true and the drive to do the good, and Aristotle's talking about truth and goodness, well, maybe Aristotle is an important guy to know. But he's got a problem. He doesn't believe in the immortality of the soul, and he also doesn't believe that the world was created at a particular time. So he would deny creatio ex nihilo, right? This is what he does not hold. So how do you bring a pagan philosopher who has a lot of really good things to say into the theological tradition in the 12th century? What are the responses? Well, of course, Latin Averroism and the Islamic tradition, they said, well, Aristotle's a good guy, and, a lot of what he says we need to prize and we need to develop. And it's very important in the Islamic tradition that we see that there's a consonance between Aristotle and some of the truths of Islam. If you don't know this, of course, Islam was very, very well represented in Moorish Spain, and there was a very, very strong intellectual tradition. I mean, the Islamic tradition of learning had eclipsed that of the Christian tradition in certainly the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, one could say. Well, there was an Augustinianism in the West, right? And we can see this Augustinianism many of these thinkers looked askance on this rediscovery of Aristotle. They thought, this is bad stuff, I mean, this guy's coming in here. So they thought that we should reject much of Aristotle and hold on to Augustinianism because Aristotle is saying things that aren't true, right? Now, a guy like Aquinas said, well, Aristotle's a great guy, but we have to synthesize him, and if we look at him deeply enough, we're going to see that the truths of Aristotle do not necessarily contradict the truths of Christianity. And so this is hard with the immortality of the soul. It's a little easier with the creation. We can understand divine creation, as I talked about in an earlier lecture, in esse rather than in theory, right? As in creation in the order of ontological dependency rather than creation in the order of time. So anyway, the 13th century synthesis, authored by Aquinas, if you will, takes Aristotle very seriously, and it tries to put together into a consonant structure, an edifice, an intellectual edifice, the learning of antiquity in Aristotle and Christian faith. One might say that the 13th century was the last time we had a completely rational view of the universe. God was in his heaven, all is right with the world, at least, ultimately, and yet all the sciences could fit in. Scotus and Occam follow Aquinas in the 14th century. Scotus is writing mostly in the late 13th century. But they're critics of Aquinas. They say, Aquinas, you put together a lot of good stuff, but you're just not philosophical enough. If you really study Aristotle and study it deeply, you're going to see that these simple consonancies, the simple consonants that you articulate really isn't there. That if we deeply, deeply look at the tradition and deeply understand this Aristotle, we're going to see that we have a movement away from a consonance of faith and reason, and that faith now must become an act of the will over and against reason. So you should be equating Aquinas with medieval intellectualism and Scotus and Occam as the movement towards voluntarism. However, Scotus is a halfway figure. He's called an adherent of the via antiqua, the old way. So in some ways he agrees with Aquinas, but his re-understanding, his new understanding of being as the most general and abstract of all concepts, takes him out of the Aquinas tradition quite deeply, quite profoundly, and it really opens up the movement to Occam and the movement towards nominalism. And by the time we get to Occam, we're holding on to the truths of the faith over and against reason's best resources. Okay? So here we go. If you look at that, the conservative Augustinian says, let's not take Aristotle. Aquinas says, let's take Aristotle, and there is a consonance in faith and reason. There's one truth. And then by the time we get to Scotus and Occam, they're saying, well, we can take, particularly Occam, we can take Aristotle, but at some places the truths of faith just trump the truths of reason, and you just got to hold on to them. It's a posit of the church tradition. The Latin avarists were sometimes called double truth advocates, heterodox Aristotelians, claimed that on rational grounds Aristotle's positions were plausible, but that Aristotle is wrong on certain issues, and the church shows where Aristotle is in error, for reason cannot. I just talked about all this, didn't I? The conservative Augustinians, they rejected Aristotle's notion that individual things have an intelligibility in themselves. And they claimed, I didn't really talk about this, that Aristotle's philosophy exemplifies the fall. Okay, they thought that with Aristotle there was a certain diminution of the sacramental view of reality. And of course this does go against Neoplatonism, and of course this was very important in the tradition, as we've talked about. We advocated an Augustinian notion of grace and supported a Platonic theory of knowledge, and of course this goes against Aristotle. Of course, Aquinas claimed that the problems of Aristotle can be worked out within the tradition of Aristotle. He interpreted Aristotle in such a way that one can argue the immortality of the soul and the creatio ex nihilo, as I've said, claim truths from Aristotle are consistent with the truths of Christianity. And then, of course, Scotus Occam and critique. The tools of Aristotle are employable and rational critique. And with Scotus and Occam, there is now a freedom and an omnipotence of God that is stressed. And we're going to talk about that when we get there, between the potentia Dei absoluta and the potentia Dei ordinata, which is the absolute power of God and the ordained power of God. With Occam particularly, you get this emphasis on logic. These are very subtle thinkers. Scotus, these guys amaze me sometimes when I look at their works. They used analytical tools in attempting a theological critique of philosophy. Basically, philosophy had gone too far. Now, there was a book by Bauer, I believe, and he argues that basically you should read the medieval tradition as coming to see faith as more and more of a heteronymous over and againstness. Okay, that when you're at Anselm's place, faith and reason are pretty nice. Reason can show you the necessity that the truths of faith are really necessary truths, and everything is nice and consonant in Aquinas. But as the tradition goes on, there is a disruption between faith and reason. And by the time we get to the 14th century, we're holding on to the truths of faith over and against our best theological and philosophical, not theological, but our best philosophical thinking. So, the early love of philosophy and theology, where philosophy is the handmaiden of theology, now she becomes a spurned mistress, right? And the love affair is no longer there, and the church says, okay, philosophy, you can do certain things. You can go out and get the water, maybe, but you can't do a lot of stuff, and we're suspicious of you. And of course, our good friend Luther and the early Lutheran professors at Wittenberg, many of them are trained in the Occamist tradition, which we'll talk about at a later point. So thank you very much for this time with you. I am Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology at the Institute of Lutheran Theology, and we'll see you next time.